evangelism. But the reality is that as the church became very connected with the state, and as the church became a very powerful entity, it is always tempting to align an institution with maintaining the power of the institution versus staying true to the original calling of the institution. That's a temptation that the churches face, just as all institutions face whenever they become successful. And the church, in many circumstances, has functioned very well under considering the temptations, and in some circumstances has not functioned so well. But I do think it's really important to look at some of the challenges that the churches has faced, and one of the ways, and the ways in which evangelism has become problematic for the church, because if we can understand that, then we can, I think, move forward in a way that is more robust and has a better success rate of connecting with people. So that's why we've been where we've been. Today, I want to talk about the white evangelical church, Christian church, in terms of evangelism. Now, and I want to say, just before I get into it, to say, if you looked at my summary for what we were going to talk about basically today, it sounds very harsh and critical of the white evangelical church. And I don't mean I don't mean to present it that way. I think that there are a lot of things that need to be, I think there is a lot of critique that the church can benefit from. And I think the white evangelical church is that proves true for them as well. However, just a little bit of my background. I've mentioned this many times before. I went to a conservative evangelical seminary. And one of the great things about going to a conservative evangelical seminary is that I learned a lot of really wonderful things about the conservative evangelical church. And I also saw the conservative evangelical church engaged in self-critique. And that was a really wonderful thing to see, because it helped me to understand that these people who come from a very different tradition than the one that I come out of, that they are just like me, and that they want to address the injustices of the past, and they want to move forward with some clarity and humanity. So I don't have anything against I don't have anything against the white evangelical church in a sense. I think that it, along with a lot of other institutions, has its issues, particularly considering the areas in which it's been successful. So with having said that, let me move on. I'm going to start to share my screen, and we're, oh, hold on. Sorry, first I'm going to fix something. Oops. All right. So I titled this portion Evangelism and Relationship, because we're really going to get into the nitty-gritty of how, when you share your faith with somebody, how it becomes an active relationship. And so the qualities of the relationship are really critical, key. And so again, to review where we've been, we talked about how in the very beginning, we talked about how the initial mission of the church was very egalitarian and very service-oriented, very concerned about caring for the poor and the widow and the slave, and that made it stand out in the Roman world. And however, as the church gained power politically and had to deal with a lot of the downsides of that sort of alignment with political power, conversion by force started to seem pretty appealing, which then fed into a movement which really took the church through the next couple of centuries, which was colonialism. So the church aligned with this Western interest of sailing around the world and establishing first initially trading partnerships with other nations around the world, then eventually dominating them politically and militarily. And the church played a role in that. Church missionaries were often the first ones into those areas, and so they established relationships, and then those relationships then turned into colonialism. And so, and of course, we know then the church, based on that connection with these, basically, what we would think of as being, I don't know, I don't think the term is correct these days, but third world countries or vulnerable populations. The church has played a part in a lot of injustice and genocide and lots of very painful and exploitation of resources and and slavery. And so the church itself has many things to lament. So why would we, and when we talked about this last time, it was pretty clear that colonialism isn't, the story of colonialism is a complex one. And that there are some things that the colonialism brought about that, you'd say, well, there was some benefit to it. So lament doesn't mean that you lament absolutely everything about it, but it does mean that you look honestly at the things that the church has done that it regrets, that it should regret, and when you do that, if the current church today can look back honestly on some of the sins of colonialism and lament it genuinely, that sort of depth of honesty will embody the church. And so that when we engage in relationship today, that relationship becomes much more, meaningful and honest, and it moves back into the egalitarianism that the original church really lifted up. So going back to my original premise, I said Christian evangelism is sharing the grace, love, and mercy. And it was suggested perhaps maybe mercy is better expressed through the word compassion. So I'm putting that there and I'm going to contemplate that. The grace, love, and mercy that God has shown to us in Jesus Christ. However, whenever and wherever the church had interests other than sharing that message for its own sake, evangelism became a tool for securing those interests first. That was my original premise that I started this series with. So we're going to look at the white evangelical church today, and initially, and then we're going to look at some other stuff. And I think that this needs to be a thoughtful, humble critique. It's easy, particularly in today's political climate, to divide ourselves into left and right and to chastise the other side brutally, because it helps us to shore up our own belief system and it helps to bond our own, what we would call our own tribe, in a sense, if that's the way you think of it. But that's not very helpful in the end, because ultimately we all share a faith. And so it's very helpful, I think, to approach it with some humility and with some compassion, particularly for people who are who belong to the white evangelical church. And again, specifically, I'm calling it the white evangelical church because the evangelical church actually is a very broad grouping of churches, of theologies. But there is specifically for white evangelical churches, are churches that serve primarily white parishioners. There is a particular theology that goes along with it that is not shared by evangelical churches of color. And there's a lot of evangelical churches of color. So there's a difference between the two. So we're looking specifically at the white evangelical church. So why would we do this? Why are we focused on this particular church? Well, because when we talk about evangelism, a lot of people immediately think of evangelical Christianity. And there's a reason why. One, because it's in their name. And two, because the evangelical branch of the Christian church is really good at evangelism. They do it really well. And they put a high priority on it. That's why they're called evangelical church. That's why it's called evangelical Christianity. In fact, it is their highest priority to share the good news of the gospel, is one way of putting it. But it's a different kind of, it has come to define evangelism. And I think that we can open up the definition of evangelism a little bit more broadly. But first we need to name what it is now. It is a church that has continued the tradition of colonial evangelism, evangelical. So if you think I had trouble with the word mirroring, evangelism can be a tricky one too. So the white evangelical church is a church that has continued the tradition of colonial evangelism, for better or for worse. Let me explain what I mean by for better or for worse. Last time I talked about how as somebody growing up in Phoenix, living in an area where Indian School Road was the main drag through the town, right? And to me, in my mind, it was just the road named Indian School. I didn't realize that it was actually named after a school it's not a Christian school, but it was a school where the state of Arizona would send kids from the tribes on the reservations. And when they sent the kids to this school, the purpose of the school was to anglicize them. And so while the kids were at the school, they had their heads shaved. They were taught English, discouraged from speaking their own traditional languages, and they were oftentimes Christianized. And so that has had that particular way of integrating Native American tribes into the white community has been devastating to the tribes themselves. And that's a legacy that is ongoing in the state of Arizona. It's probably also in California as well, but I'm not familiar with it as much as I am there. However, let me say something about evangelical Christianity on the reservations. And a lot of the Christian churches that are Native churches Native Christian churches on the reservations are conservative evangelical churches. So when I was doing chaplaincy in the hospital, I was good friends with a man who was a pastor of a church on the reservation, and he was it was a Native church. He was Native American, and it was a Baptist church. It was a conservative evangelical Baptist church. And this was a big man, and he had very interesting ideas about. He had a very different theology than I did, but we were friends. And one of the things I got to know about him was that he was a huge source of stability for his community. And so even though I would look at his theology and say, well, not really, I wouldn't buy into that. That's kind of rough, and very, it seems to be continuing the colonial idea about Christianity. But nevertheless, this was a man he ran an orphanage. So kids whose parents had either died because of alcoholism or couldn't parent because of alcoholism, which is a real problem on the reservation, he would take the kids in. And so he was sort of the strength in the community. And so the evangelical church does offer this real clear strength for communities in crisis. And so that's I think we can't really understand the full measure of what this church means if we don't appreciate its role in communities that are in crisis. But so we have to ask ourselves, does this evangelical church, conservative evangelical church, does it define evangelism? And if so, how do churches like ours, which is not an evangelical church, but a mainline denominational church, how do we do evangelism? And frankly, we've just kind of stepped away from evangelism and let this church do it. And we've tried to find other ways of defining ourselves. Before I get into too much more, I want to just take a moment and just say that the evangelical church is not one monolith. It has a lot of different branches. There's a political evangelicals, which are the ones that we know who have been very active politically over the last 20, 30 years, 40 years. They are the political right. They're deeply embedded into the political right wing of the Republican Party. There's neo-fundamentalists, which are really sort of evangelicals who've pulled, they're not that engaged in politics, although they do tend to vote with the political evangelicals, but they're very, very fundamentalist. Then there's the evangelicals. Those are the super fabulous mega churches with pastors who wear jeans and have tattoos, and they've just really kind of gotten this sort of pull them in with engaging music and, daily advice and worship service in the sermons. And, they're the mega churches. There are kingdom Christians who are very, they don't take political positions particularly. In fact, they often don't take positions in terms of theological questions of sexuality or other justice issues, but they are very concerned with spreading the kingdom of God on earth, which does involve lots of missionary, feeding the hungry, and caring for those who are vulnerable. So they do a lot of mission work. Then there's peace and justice evangelicals. This would be like the Democrat evangelicals, and there's a lot of them. This is like Sojourners. If you're familiar with Sojourners magazine, that's the peace and justice branch of the evangelical church. So just as to say that this is not a monolith. So what's the difference between the evangelical church and mainline churches like St. Andrew's? Well, the evangelical church believes in personal salvation and personal morality. So that's why, so the focus for the evangelical church is often just, this is about you and your relationship with Jesus, accepting Jesus as your Lord and Savior, and your own personal morality. How are you behaving in the world, and in morality in terms of sexuality and behavior and lots of other areas of life go into that, but we're not going to get too much into that. For the mainline church, the consideration is really more social salvation. How are our communities functioning? How do we work towards the salvation of our community, and our social morality? How are our political figures behaving? How are our institutions supporting a moral, just function in society? The evangelical church really has a kind of a biblical literalism outlook. There are variations on that. It's not one size fits all, but it is fair to characterize it as having some form of biblical literalism. The mainline church, however, values theological complexity. I don't think I really need to get into that too much, but I think we've probably all experienced it, the theological complexity so for mainline churches, it's preaching is generally more educational rather than advice giving. The evangelical church tends to have an emphasis on conformity and control, whereas the mainline church tends to serve families. It's less controlling. In fact, sometimes families control the church. So the mainline church does not have so much of an emphasis on controlling the people around it. I want to just say briefly, when I was in Arizona, our house backed up to a Mormon church. So I'd get up in the morning on Sunday morning and get ready to go to do, church and worship and all that. And I would see all the Mormons coming to church, and their parking lot was full in the morning. And then I would come home from church in the afternoon and their parking lot was still full. So this Mormon church, and the Mormon church tends to be a conservative, more evangelical church, not quite evangelical, but they tend to fall into that category of conformity and control. And I looked at it and I thought, what we Presbyterians really need, the problem for us Presbyterians is that we're not controlling enough. We haven't guilted our people into coming to church every Sunday like the Mormons have. And I don't mean to diminish the Mormons. Mormons are really wonderful people, but you can see that the impact of having a tightly knit community that has a lot of, that emphasizes conformity and has a lot of control over its people. The impact is that they tend to go to church on Sundays, whereas in Presbyterian church, it's a little bit less, it's freer. The evangelical church tends to focus on being born again, which goes back to that personal salvation. What is your relationship with Jesus? Do you accept Jesus as your Lord and Savior? It's a one and done. It happens and it's done. And then the rest of your faith life is living that out. The mainline church is more born into. So the mainline church, because it tends to be oriented around families and generational families, you tend to be born into the mainline church. And so it's not a one and done. It's a lifelong relationship. The evangelical church tends to be more hands, less talk. One of my favorite experiences in seminary was, one of my best friends in seminary was a Mennonite. Mennonites tend to be more on the spectrum of evangelical church. And one day we were in class and we were talking about worship and the different denominations, how the different denominations did worship and mission and all that. And he turned around to me and he said, "Oh, you Presbyterians, you talk. We Mennonites, we talk with our hands." And I thought that was really a good, nice critique of Presbyterianism, because we do tend to talk a lot. And we have committees, and our sermons tend to be educational, and we have a lot of adult education, and we do a lot of contemplating and considering. And that's a wonderful thing. Don't get me wrong. I'm in the Presbyterian church for a reason, but that can distract us from working with our hands and actually taking action in the world. The evangelical church tends to be the face of the church. When we talk about the Christian church in the larger culture, people do tend to think of this conservative evangelical church, which has a particular position on homosexuality, has a particular political viewpoint. And partly the reason why they are the face of the church in the world is because they're louder. They do tend to speak in public forums much more forcefully. Whereas the mainline church is that quiet, stable church. The mainline church has been the church, been the Christian church, the Protestant Christian church in the community for generations. And it's been stable. Not so much in the last 40 years, we are seeing a decline, and that has to do with the generational church stuff, which I'll get to next. So the evangelical church tends to be the mainline church, mega churches. And mega churches are churches that are very large because they do emphasize the experience of being in church. So it is a church experience that emphasizes, great music. We want to get you singing. We want to get you, tapping your feet, even standing up and raising your hands. Just get your whole body into this worship service. And then our sermons are going to be, it's going to be a nice, entertaining talk for, 45 minutes about, how you can live your life better and how your daily life can be influenced by your faith and what that looks like. And so the real emphasis is on the experience of worship, and so it draws people because they like that experience, and it takes a lot of money and effort to get that experience to continue to be engaging. The generational church is different. The generational church, you go to church because that's where your mom is, and she wants you to get there. And this is where you grew up going to church. And then when you have kids, this is where you want to raise your kids in church. And so there's not so much emphasis on having a great worship service and having a great, engaging worship service. It's really more about the community itself. And so there isn't so much emphasis on needing to be flashy and engaging and entertaining. So finally, the evangelical church has a high engagement in evangelism, spreading the gospel to all the world. So one of the pressures that you start to face as you become a member of an evangelical church is that you need to share the gospel to your friends and your neighbors. You need to bring them to church. There is a high emphasis on that aspect of the church, and actually it works. That's why there is such a thing as megachurches. Of course, it's emphasized, it's influenced also by the entertainment value that you get from the church, so it's got to be something that's going to hold them. But the mainline church has a low engagement in evangelism because we're generational. Okay, our family always went to the Presbyterian church on that street, and I know your family always went to the Lutheran church on that street, and we're not going to try to change you and bring you into our church because that's where your family went, and that's where your family will continue to go. Or you're a part of the Episcopalian church, or you went to the synagogue, or you went to the Bible church down the road. So it's like there's a sense of community and family, and this is just how we do it. And so we don't really need to spread the word of the gospel, because it's just what we do and where we go, and it's a part of our family life, and not so much something that we need to pass on and spread. Oops. But evangelical church is the face of evangelism. So it's come to define what evangelism is. And the evangelical church has a lot of strengths, but it has some problems, I think, too. And so some of the strengths that has helped it in evangelism is, in the evangelical church, God is somewhat transactional. If you do this, then God will give you that. And that's that's a simple sell around God. If you are suffering and experiencing poverty, and you go to church and praise God and become a part of this community and act a certain way, and you accept Jesus as your Lord and Savior, and your personal morality changes, God will bless you with prosperity or energy or whatever it is that you need. Now, not every evangelical church is that simplistic. I don't want to paint them with a broad strokes, but that is a part of the belief system embedded in the evangelical church. It's part of the reason why a lot of the sermons in the evangelical church are, this is daily life, because it helps us to understand sort of in a transactional way how our faith life can make our daily life easier. The evangelical church tends to provide clear answers to problems. It also provides an enemy and a call to action. The enemy can be Satan, who's trying to tempt you. The enemy can be that political party that is trying to erode social norms. It could be all these things, but the main thing is that here's an enemy, and if you can just either conquer the enemy or keep the enemy at bay, or define yourself in opposition to the enemy, you're going to be okay. And here's a call to action, by the way, that will either it's political call to action or a social call to action, and that gives people things to do that will, and people like things to do, and there's nothing wrong with having things to do. But the problem comes into play when the call to action involves trying to fight an enemy that has its limitations. Oh, and the liberal church can do that too. So I don't want to just let us slide as well, or let the liberal church, to whatever degree you think of yourself as being part of the liberal church. The evangelical church also comes out of a legacy of power over others, with good intentions, in a sense. So if your life is falling apart and you need help, if you're struggling with alcoholism, or if you're struggling with a gambling addiction, or if you're struggling with all kinds of other problems that in your life, if you submit yourself to the power of the church, if you submit yourself to the theology that the church espouses, and your life will change. And in many situations, it does. And so it has its benefits and its intentions are good. However, it lends itself to a culture of conformity and control. And cultures of conformity and control quickly become domineering and power-based. And there's two examples of how that can go really, really wrong. And the first one I want to share with you is a guy named Rob Bell. Now, some of you may know Rob Bell, be familiar with it. He wrote a book called Love Wins. He was an evangelical pastor of a big mega church. And he wrote a book called Love Wins. And Love Wins was a book that just considered the possibility that perhaps there was no such thing as hell. And perhaps God actually did love everybody. And at the end of the day, everyone was saved. That's an idea. It's a theology called universalism. And Rob Bell just opened up the door to consider this theology. And as a result, he was ostracized by the evangelical community completely. I mean, it was really nasty. If you Google Rob Bell and you start reading information on him, you will, especially ones that have, where people can then like comment on it from as a forum, you will see a lot of evangelicals just chastising him as if he is the devil himself. And the reason why Rob Bell is so hated by much of the evangelical church, or a portion of the evangelical church, is because he was an insider who breached that conformity. And so that's a huge threat to the evangelical church. And that goes back to the simple answers, clear answers that provide an enemy and a call to action. That's the downside of it, is that once you start to question those clear answers, you then become the enemy. And so it doesn't create an environment where you can really explore the questions of theological complexity. And that's why when people think of evangelism, a lot of times their defenses get up because they think, you're going to draw me into a way of thinking and living where I am going to lose all the ability to question reality, question the Bible. I'm going to lose my capacity for free thinking. And that there's a reason why people think that way. I want to share with you, and the other thing is, this is, I'm going to tune into you because I haven't seen you in a while, so I'm going to look in. Okay, now I want to share my screen. I don't know if you can see this, but this is a curriculum called Can I Ask That? I used to do a lot of youth work with youth who were part of, they were conservative Christians, and also coming out of Fuller has this youth program curriculum called Sticky Faith. And the reason they called it Sticky Faith was because they were finding that a lot of their youth, when they went off to college, were leaving the church. And why were they leaving the church? Well, this is what Fuller's found. Young people, this is what Fuller Sticky Faith curriculum says. Young people cited the church's failure to wrestle with issues like the reliability of the biblical text, sexuality, evolution versus creation, and the exclusivity of Jesus. But notice those students did not leave the faith because of the church's stance on these issues. They left simply because the church failed to address them at all. So this inability to talk about difficult issues for young people became a real problem. And so they ended up saying, going to college where they were encouraged to really examine issues and look deeply into, not just to accept information based on faith. They were being taught to think for themselves, and that created a conflict for themselves and the church. And Fuller Seminary said, this is a real problem for us. We are losing young people like crazy. It's not just the mainline denominations, the evangelical church was doing it too. So they came up with this curriculum, Can I Ask That? And this was a fantastic curriculum. And it took some of the most difficult questions, and it just gave them permission to ask the questions. And so then this was like one of the most popular things I ever did at church was to teach basic. And we would get, and the parents were curious too. It's like, can I ask that? So there is this hunger in the evangelical church, as in all churches, to really wrestle with some difficult issues and just open the door. Let's look at it. So I'm going to go back to sharing my screen, go back to my presentation. So that was one of the problems of evangelism, is that it is, when you talk about evangelism with people, it really does have this sort of cultural baggage around around conformity and control. And so the question that I ask myself is, can evangelism be done in another way? In other words, can it shed some of that baggage? And evangelism become a demonstration of our faith as the early church showed, where people could just see the church living out what it means to be a follower of Jesus, and then be freed to ask themselves, does that look like something I would want to be a part of? So I do see that happening in the church. And we don't exactly call it evangelism, but it's often tied with what we call mission. And mission and evangelism, again, are hard to separate. So one of them is Frontera de Cristo. So I want to show you this video about Frontera de Cristo. Let me see. I'm going to get to it first. Oops. Okay, so I can't, let me see if I can see you. Okay, so if you can't, give me a thumbs up if you can hear this.
Borders mean lots of things. People will talk about borders as places of exclusion or of hatred, even, and death. But borders don't have to be places of division. God calls us to live into the reality that borders are also places of encounter, opportunity, and hope. Not just here on the U.S.-Mexico border, but wherever we lived and whatever borders that exist that divide us from other places. The ministry of Frontera de Cristo is centered in the community of Douglas Namo Prieta. They grew up together. They're both about 120 years old. Frontera de Cristo seeks to work in partnership with people and organizations on both sides of the border and listen to what are the visions of the community and how can we support making those gospel visions realities.
When we started doing partnership, it was like not Frontera de Cristo doing things, but supporting organizations that need it. We were just thinking, how can we support directly to the migrants? People that are waiting to ask for asylum to the States, that are living in a tent in the line on the border, and they're very vulnerable to the organized crime. Our volunteers go, pick them up, walk with them, because they need to be safe. So the Migrant Resource Center is a place where people that are seeking asylum can come and use the restrooms, take showers, and we provide clothing, shoes, water, coffee, some food. We also provide medicine. The goal of the Migrant Resource Center is supporting our migrant brothers and sisters, whatever their legal status is, to be welcome and to feel safety in Agua Prieta. And with the children, you can see the smiles of, finally, we find a place where we're going to be safe.
Cuando llegué a esta ciudad de Agua Prieta, me conocí con el pastor Marcos Adams. Nos sentamos para pensar en algo que diera respuesta a esta situación migratoria. Y lo más rentable fue una cooperativa de campesinos que tuviéramos la oportunidad de darle el valor agregado a nuestro producto. Entonces, Café Justo inició hace casi 18 años.
We want gospel values to be represented in how we treat those who are migrating, those who are seeking refuge, those who are fleeing extreme poverty or extreme violence, and move beyond just the humanitarian piece. Sometimes it's easier just to pick people up off the side of the road. But if we keep finding people on the side of the road in the same place, sooner or later we have to figure out, how do we fix the road? The farmers from Café Justo gave us one way of people being able to stay on their land and not even have to go over that dangerous road.
The idea behind Café Justo is to address one of the root causes of migration, which are economics. Many families were pushed to migrate because of the low prices on coffee. When instead of $1.50 for every pound of coffee, they start receiving between 20 to 30 cents instead, a lot of people didn't see any other choice but to migrate. So Café Justo is giving them the opportunity to control every aspect of the business. Farmers, they don't just receive a fair price, but they control the processing of the coffee, the exporting of the coffee, the marketing. And in the coffee business, that's where the money really is. So one of the positive impacts that we've been witnessing lately is migration in reverse. People that had left, they're returning back because what they have now that they didn't have before is options. And migrate if they want to, but don't migrate because they have no other choice.
Creemos y hemos comprobado que esto ha sido la mejor manera de convencer a muchas familias para que se queden en su comunidad.
Our relationship with Frontera de Cristo has been really great since the beginning. We just see each other like family. Even though they're doing their piece and we are doing our piece, at the end we're working together for peacemaking.
The church here has such an incredible role because the church extends beyond all borders.
We don't see each other as different towns or as strangers. We see us as a whole community that just happened to be divided by this wall.
Hay dos ciudades que se hermanan, Douglas y Agua Prieta, y eso es lo que se ha hecho. Douglas puede compartir esa experiencia de hermandad con los otros estados de Estados Unidos, y Agua Prieta puede compartir en todo México. Yo creo que sí lo podemos lograr.
As Christians, we are commanded to go out. We are not commanded to stay put and just pray. We need to go out and engage and see what we can do in our own communities.
Peacemaking, I think, is the responsibility for all those who follow Christ, the Prince of Peace. Here on the border and in different places where we enter more fully into suffering, we can experience joy more fully. And I think when we don't enter into the suffering of the world, the joy is muted when we see the 18-foot steel barrier that separates our communities from one another. It's a reminder of the work that we have as people of faith to work for a world where Jesus has broken down the dividing walls of hostility, and we can cultivate community across borders.
Okay, I'm going to share a couple more screens and then we'll talk. I've been going through a lot of stuff, I know. I was going to talk about worthwhile adventures, but we don't have time. Maybe I'll mention them later. But the Christian church originally was and is countercultural, meaning it was an egalitarian system. It had provided a strong theological resource for the people in a time of need. It had norms of social service and community solidarity, and that the practices of the church reflected the good news that Jesus Christ was God amongst us, present with us, and that God loved people, all people, no matter whether you're rich or poor or vulnerable or strong, that God was connected to you without any sort of intervention. And so if we're going to share the good news of the gospel, I think that good news has to embody all of those characteristics. And that's what I see in work like what Mark Adams is doing. I'll say a couple more things about Frontera de Cristo. This is one of 5 binational ministries of the Presbyterian Church USA. And it is, it supports, it's located on the Douglas side of the border. Agua Prieta is right across the border. And so they do they form partnerships with organizations on the other side of the border, Agua Prieta. So we as Presbyterians can go down there and sort of see some of the work that they're doing and go across the border. And then and when you do that, you go across the border, you worship with the churches across the border, and you meet people and you engage with them, and you see the work that's being done there and the things that Frontera de Cristo is supporting. Frontera de Cristo is supporting primarily three things. The Migrant Resource Center that we saw there, which is on the Agua Prieta side of the border, so that when migrants who are traveling up and trying to immigrate to the United States and they get stuck at the border there and they end up living in tents, and it's a very, very dangerous situation. And so the Migrant Resource Center is there to sort of help them and protect them. It's the ultimate in hospitality. And they just give them a little bit of food, a shower, some socks, some medicine if they need it. They will give them phones to call people at home to let them know they're alive and safe. But they don't, so they're not engaging in the political part of it. They're engaging in the hospitality branch of it in that sense. Cafe Justo is a support. It's a collaborative roaster for coffees. So these farmers can roast their own coffee and sell them for their and retain all the profits. So it enables them to stay on their land, and it helps to discourage immigration in the first place. Most of those people who do immigrate, they would rather stay at home, but they just can't afford to. It's a matter typically of life and death. That's what drives people across the border. And they also work with an orphanage and a drug treatment center there. So there's other things that that Frontera de Cristo does. Mark Adams is an amazing guy. You might have seen him recently. He was interviewed on the PBS NewsHour about issues around the border. So he's an amazing man. He's a Presbyterian pastor, a really good guy. So with that, and I see him doing evangelism. What I see his ministry is all about evangelism. It's about demonstrating in the world what it looks like to be a Christian, and he is a bigger draw in our church than anything in Southwest that I've known, than anything else that I've seen lately. But I'll say one more thing and then I will finally stop. But I work with a lot of youth, and I do a camp in the summer I'm a chaplain for a camp I've been for years in Arizona. I have done youth work with kids in most of my ministry, and little children, and I've got my own kids. And when I ask kids between 26 and 15, what do you want the church to be? What does the church need to be for you? What they say eventually, always, one thing they say is, I want to be accepted. Oh, I just want to be accepted for who I am. The other thing that they say is, I want to do something. I want to do something in the world. I want my faith to be something that brings me out into the world and is a call to action. They're looking for that call to action, which I think is why the evangelism of the white evangelical church is so appealing to people. It is a call to action. I'm not sure that it's always the best call to action or the most Christian call to action if we define it based on the early church. But there's many, many different ways to fulfill that. So I said a lot. This is kind of the crux of my presentation. So that I'm going to stop now and open it up to you, and Tom can unmute you all. And if you have comments or thoughts you want to share, just spend the rest of the time in that.
Well, I can ask you to unmute. I can't actually unmute you. You need to do that yourself. And I will
unmute it.
You get the gallery shot.
Boy, if I had a good back and good knees and good parts, I would be down there in a half a second. Just being down there. It gives me a headache to think of the problems that are going on down there. And it gives me a headache to think that there are people who think that as Christians, we don't really care about the real situation.
Oh, Dana, to encourage you, I've gone down there with a walker, the kind with the brakes and all of that, and they let me cut some wood, and then I also, the big thing I do is read to the children. I have Spanish books. And
my problem is I can't the most chairs I can't sit on because I can't get up. So it's a little bit more than just a walker.
Yeah.
But gosh, I'd like to support that organization.
Well,
Yeah.
and Mark Adams does, he travels around the US and will come and talk to churches too. So he'll bring some, and the other way that you can support that organization is by churches a lot of times will serve and sell Cafe Justo. So it becomes a way of being able to just, most of us drink coffee. If you buy the Cafe Justo, you are supporting Mexican farmers
Oh,
and enabling them to stay on their land. And churches can sell it.
if we're ever back in real coffee hour.
Yeah. If and when we're back.
Jen, you mentioned recently, I think you mentioned the book Bowling Alone and how, so many people feel isolated. And I think one of the appeals of mega churches is, from my understanding, is that within mega churches, they have their own communities, like young marrieds, or divorced people, so they can find a home that they may not find elsewhere.
Right. So agreed. And so there's this nice quote from I can't remember the theologian. He says, no, actually it's from Star Trek. He says, being with people just for the sake of being with people is another word for hell. but being with people for the purpose of, we're not with each other just for the purpose of being with each other. We're with each other for the purpose of carrying out some action in the world, to join in a purpose. If we're just together just to hang out with each other and we lose our sense of purpose, then we will eventually sort of break down into infighting and we'll just get on each other's nerves and because human beings we're fallible, but if we come together with a purpose, whether that purpose to serve the community, to be the hands and feet of Christ in the world, then you're a much more sustainable community. Yeah.
I'd actually like to share a general sense of what's going on in my mind here, and there is some I don't know, 35, maybe 40 of us sitting here at this time, and we've been sharing this, and Jen has been reframing for us evangelism, and so 6 months ago, if you reached out to our congregation and said, "Oh, we have to, jump into evangelism, and we have to be evangelical, and we need to move forward," you got this horrendous pushback. It's not us. It's not who we are. And yet, the people who are here today, 35 of us or so, are roughly half of the active congregation at St. Andrews. Not half our membership, but half of the active congregation. Jen has reframed for us what it means to be evangelistic, or what evangelism is. And we can begin to share that with our brothers and sisters who haven't had a chance to hear this and say, "We don't want to do evangelism. I'm not going knocking on doors." So thank you, Jen. Thanks.
And I'm sorry, also real quickly, as we move on, we will see, we don't have to go to the border to do it. There are ways that we can do it right here at home. Sorry, Tom, go ahead.
I wanted to mention Clergy and Laity United for Economic Justice, which has a Santa Barbara chapter that I've attended on a few occasions, but haven't stuck with. And there are many opportunities, I think, in our own backyard. We don't necessarily have to travel. I think the program you mentioned is an excellent program, and certainly does give us a wider viewpoint about economic justice. It's not just building places, it's finding out and providing food, but finding why are people hungry? What can we do to get to the sources of the problems and not just treat the problems themselves?
Yeah, and that comes about by partnership. I mean, the Frontera de Cristo doesn't do anything on its own. It joins in partnership with the people who live in the area, which is I think a really important aspect of that. Where, any other comments before I
Jen, Judy,
done? Oh, okay.
I just wanted to thank you for laying out the differences of the evangelical church and the mainline church, because it does get really confusing. And it's good to see the differences and try to look for them when you're talking to people. And
One of the things that is that the mainline denomination has been declining significantly. We all know that. And part of the reason why that is because we don't get members very often. But when we do, they stay for generations usually. But however, the culture is shifted in such a way that church is not a part of daily life. And so we're not getting, a lot of the next generation of the church doesn't even think about the church being a necessary part of their week, right? And there's a lot of baggage behind that. However, when COVID hit, the mainline denomination churches are the ones that could go offline, could go online and maintain their membership. Why? Because their membership is so dedicated and so connected. Whereas, down the street, Living Streams, they're doing outdoor worship. They had to, because really, and it's a wonderful church, I'm sure. Please don't take this as any critique of them. But because they're more evangelical, because their emphasis is more on the experience of, being in worship, and it's a draw. If they don't have that in-person experience, they don't have their strong suit. I mean, they have lost their real superpower. Real devastation for them. That's one way to think about the differences between the two.
I used to know somebody who belonged to one of those churches, and their husband was dying in the ICU. And I said, "Can't you call someone from your church?" And she said, "I don't know anybody at my church." There you go.
Yeah.
To me, that said it all right there. They didn't even know who the preacher was to get their number to call them, because,
Wow.
It's a lot of different ways of being church.
And some of them do have small groups that meet as well as larger worship times. So that provides a smaller sense of community for them.
Well, it is 12:04, so I'm just going to say briefly, so next week we're going to talk more and more. So the next 2 weeks, we're going to talk more and more about what it looks like to be the presence in how evangelism as a presence has real strong impact on the people around and can emanate hope and joy and community. So we'll talk more and more and more about that. I'm going to close us with prayer, and then we can go our separate ways. How's that? Gracious Lord, we thank you that you have become a part of our lives, and we ask that you would just shine forth in us so that this place would be a place of hope and hospitality and community for all those who might be looking for that. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.